Those of us in Lower Manhattan best know Thomas Fleming as an historian, a distinguished writer of history, most of all of the American Revolutionary period. In fact, there is even much more to Thomas Fleming and his life. Tom is among a small minority of writers in any age who have been successful and published, writing numerous works of both fiction and nonfiction. He has authored a total of 25 books so far. As well, Tom is a journalist who has written numerous articles. Throughout his career, he has received many awards, and beyond his writing, Tom Fleming has been the president of two prominent organizations, both Penn and the Society of American Historians. More than anything else, Tom is a brilliant storyteller, and here in this video self-portrait, he tells the story of his own life that will enchant anyone who appreciates a life of accomplishment, as well as a saga rich in his telling of the times Tom Fleming has lived. We start at the beginning. This is part one of a two-part self-portrait. Enjoy the story of our times as experienced by Thomas Fleming.
I was born in 1927, and I started across the river in Jersey City. And my most vivid memory of Jersey City is one that I will never forget. I came out of a baseball game where we had our own stadium, Roosevelt Stadium, out beyond Bayonne. We've come out of Roosevelt Stadium, and we're walking through the parking lot, and suddenly my father puts his hand on my shoulder and guides me around in a couple more cars, and we go down to see this very tall guy in a gray derby and a very expensive looking top coat. And my father says to this gentleman, "Mayor, I'd like you to meet my son." He glared down at me and leaned down so that he could talk right almost face to face with this little 7-year-old, and he said, "Your old man is a hell of a guy." This was my first encounter with Frank Hague. He was the mayor of Jersey City. He was also the boss of New Jersey. If you didn't agree with the way Frank Hague did things, the best thing to do was leave Jersey City and quite possibly the country. He didn't kill people, but he made their lives very uncomfortable for quite a while. From that instant, for the next 10 years at least, I became an absolute total devotee of the Democratic Party, and particularly the part that's led by Frank Hague. Exactly why he thought my father was a hell of a guy, Frank Hague. My father was one of his right-hand men. He was the leader of the 6th Ward, and a ward leader in a Democratic city was a very powerful man. He also was elected to various jobs. All the ward leaders were put up by the organization for public official jobs. And so at that time, he was chairman of the Board of Freeholders. And later on, he became sheriff of Hudson County. Those were very powerful jobs. Huge amounts of money was changing hands on the Board of Freeholders. And the sheriff of the county had one incredibly important responsibility. He selected, or he participated in selecting, the grand jury. My father emanated a certain power. He was stocky, burly, big head, and a gruff voice. And he could be very charming. On the other hand, he was a born politician. And when my father got a guy a job on a WPA, he wanted to know, "Are you still voting the straight ticket? And if you are, you better keep voting it if you want to keep this job." It was tough stuff, you know. But as a result, of course, they carried New Jersey in big contests for the governor and for a presidency and so forth. And I like to say, in later years, I wrote this once in one of my books, where most families in Jersey City had a picture of the Sacred Heart, that's the Sacred Heart of Jesus, in the vestibule. We didn't have that picture in our vestibule. We had a picture of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And that guy's name was sacred in Jersey City. Frank Hague remarked at one point that if it wasn't for Roosevelt, most of the people in this city wouldn't be owning their own houses. They'd be part of a communist country, and it was a very rough experience. And I went to a school downtown called St. Peter's Prep. That was a Jesuit preparatory school, and so I became a very religious young man at this point, and I had a problem that soon became very serious to me. One of the Jesuits decided that I had a vocation to be a priest, and during my junior year in St. Peter's Prep, he had me in his office at least once a week and sometimes twice, trying to convince me to join the Jesuits. And I was a very troubled young man by this whole thing. I mean, I was religious. I could see what the value of joining a religious order if you truly love God and Jesus and all that. But I also had this tremendous ambition to be a writer, really being troubled by this. And one night in the summer between my junior and senior year, I found my father sitting on the porch of our vacation house on a very nice side street off the beach in Point Pleasant. And I sat down and I said, I've got a real problem. I wonder, could I talk to you? My father was not a well-educated man. He barely got out of the 8th grade like most people of his era. And but he was pretty intelligent, to put it mildly, and very tough, laconic, and so I told him about this priest who was out to persuade me, and my mother he more or less had persuaded my mother that this would be a wonderful idea, and she was diplomatic about it, but she realized I had to make up my own mind and all that, but still, she definitely leaned in that direction. Anyway, my father heard me go on for about 10 minutes on in this thing, and then there was a long silence, and then out of the darkness his voice said, I think that would be a great waste. And I think right then and there that was the end of my vocation. My father emanated a certain power. He was stocky, burly, big head, and a gruff voice. And he could be very charming. On the other hand, he was a born politician. There's no two ways about it. And so that was the beginning, or you might say, of the end of my vocation. I was in senior year, and this priest was still kind of pursuing me, even though I told him I didn't think I really wanted to do it, etc., etc. And I suddenly got a wonderful idea. Not I alone, and there was a group of us who decided. Now we're now in 1945, and the World War II is raging, and we know we're all going to be drafted when we graduate from school. So one of our group said, "Why don't we join the Navy instead of waiting for the draft and you wind up in the Army and so forth?" And so we all said it was an impulse thing completely. Yeah, it's a great idea. And we went over to New York and joined the Navy on the spot, just about. And up here at the Naval Training Station, this was way upstate New York on Lake Seneca, one of the 5 finger lakes of New York. And it was, everybody lived in barracks around a big square. There was about 8 or 10 of these squares. There was thousands of sailors up there, or would-be sailors, all being trained. And I got the greatest shock of my life when I walked into my barracks. The first 3 guys I saw were black. They were black Americans, and I just couldn't believe my eyes. And next thing you know, I was given a bunk. And I had my bag, the sailor's bag, you compare it. I threw it on the bunk. And sitting on my right, on the bunk on my right was a black guy. On the bunk on my left was a black guy. And sleeping on the bunk above me was a black guy. And it turned out that we were in one of the first, perhaps the first, but it was the first integrated company in the history of the U.S. Navy. And it was a huge experience to all of us, not especially to me, because I, as a Catholic, this is the good thing I think about being educated as a Catholic. We were taught again and again by the nuns and by the Jesuits that we and blacks were equal. That we had to treat a black person as a fellow American and so forth and so forth. We did not have any of the prejudice against blacks that people from other parts of the country had, and even from other parts of New Jersey had. It was a tribute to our education, and so it was a tremendously important experience, and it continued into my career in the Navy. So I graduated from boot camp, if you want to call it that, and I got to leave, and we came home and so forth, and then we went back up to the Naval Training Station, and the next thing you know, I was being trained to participate in the invasion of Japan. This was it was summer of 1945, and we were learning how to run these little landing craft. They had Lake Seneca was a big lake. And they had maybe 10 or 15 or 20 of them, and you'd go out there and train. Pull it up, run it up on the beach, back it off, and all that sort of thing. And they weren't kidding. They were telling us this is going to be a rough period. A lot of you guys are not going to come out of this in one piece, and that was kind of scary, to put it mildly, and so forth. And then one morning we got up, and there was a sort of an air of excitement, and some guys were running around from one barracks to another and so forth. And we finally grabbed one of these guys, and they said, "What the hell's going on? What's the excitement?" They said, "The war's over. They dropped an atomic bomb on Japan." And everybody in this big square, where we were all training to be in the amphibs, we went nuts. We danced around the street and up and down and all around, screaming, yelling. Practically, we didn't kiss each other, but I mean, we shook hands about 100 times. We're free, and so forth and so forth. We're going to stay alive, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it was again, a lot of people criticize our decision to drop the bomb and so forth, and that is there's some validity to it, perhaps, but I'll never forget the fact that I participated in what it felt like the guys who were aware that their lives were on the line. So the next thing you know, I was on a troop train going west out to Portland, Oregon, which was my first glimpse of the United States in the West, and it was a hugely important experience to me. I didn't realize, if you grow up in a city like Jersey City, and right across the river from New York, you're just used to this idea of a crowded America and so forth, and you saw these immense plains and these valleys full of nobody, and so forth as we crossed the Rockies. It was just a tremendous experience to me. We were part of the 7th Fleet, and we were getting ready to go out to the Pacific, and suddenly the word went through the ship like what we call scuttlebutt in the Navy. It's almost, nobody knows how it goes from one part of the ship to another. Zoom, 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 and they said there are black guys in a landing craft, and they're going out to board the USS Alabama. Whoa! Everybody on the ship who could leave his station, the guys in the engine room had to stay there or whatever, made a mad dash to this up in the superstructure, and there was this pretty big landing craft with maybe 50 black sailors in it, and they stood there, just with their white hats and the black faces and so forth. And I wondered if some of them were from my company, because none of them were in my amphibious training experience, and so we watched them go out, and they got to the Alabama, and they got out of the landing craft, and they went up a ladder and to the deck of the Alabama, a battleship, a really big ship, and so we all started thinking, what does it mean? Are they going to bring black sailors on the ships now, and so forth and so forth? They did have black sailors on every ship, of any size, but they worked for the officers. They served the officers dinner, and there were only a small group of them, maybe 10 or 15 or 20, depending on the size of the ship and so forth. But that was it, and they lived apart from the white crew and so forth. It was segregated, in other words. This was the way the Navy ran things when I went aboard the USS Topeka. And so we were absolutely goggle-eyed as to what was going to happen. And pretty soon, the word went around the ship again. And there were other ships in the harbor, people were all looking, watching, and so forth. And then the word went out, they're coming back. And we all made this dash above deck again. And there we were, looking at the landing craft. And the black sailors, all of them, were going back to shore. And their heads seemed to be, to me anyway, seemed to be bowed a little lower, so with the white caps on, the white sailors had. And then we had to find out what the hell happened. Well, it turned out the commander, the admiral aboard, the battleship very often had an admiral aboard, as well as a captain. And the admiral aboard the Alabama was from Alabama. And when he saw these 50 or 60 black sailors coming on this ship, he said, where the hell are they coming from? And they explained, oh, this is a new policy of the Navy. And they said, no black sailor is coming on any ship that I command. Put them ashore. So we had a fascinating time for 3 or 4 months of the occupation Navy, and we learned so much about Japan. We went on Liberty. I'll tell you, talk about talk about an encounter with history, which I think a lot of my life is all about. This was one of my great encounters, most awful encounters with history. We were anchored in Tokyo Harbor. It was actually called Yokosuka, which was the port of Tokyo. Sort of like Long Beach was the port of Los Angeles, and so they decided after they'd been checking things out and so forth that we could go ashore and have liberty, as the sailors called it. So we got on a train, and we rode for about an hour, and we get off the train in Tokyo, and we got off. It was another unbelievable shock. There was no Tokyo. The railroad station was made of stone. That was one building, and there were 2 other buildings that were stone. One was was a club for enlisted men. The other was a club for officers, and that was all that was left of Tokyo. As far as you could look, right over the horizon, it was burned flat. There was no house. There wasn't a shred of anything. This was what we did with the firebombs. This was not an atomic bomb. This was the firebombing. All these houses were wood. And later found out, we killed like 160,000 people in Tokyo in several fire raids. It was unbelievable. So finally came one day when I left. I saw that I was going to be discharged from the Navy. Everybody who had joined before the war ended was going to be discharged. So I was a really lucky break for me. So the next thing you know, I was on a troop ship, and I was on a troop train, and I was discharged at a Navy center on Long Island. And my father met me in his car, and with a couple of his pals. One thing I did when I heard that I was getting out, I said to my father, get me into a college, any college. But this was late August, and I knew that if I didn't get in September, I'd miss a whole year, and I didn't want that to happen. So he called up a few Jesuits he knew, and they got me into Fort. I had a turning point moment in my junior year. My father said to me, "What are you going to be when you get out of Fordham?" And I said, I knew what I wanted to be by this time. I wanted to be a writer. I really did. And I had gotten encouragement from some of my teachers at Fordham, and I really felt this was a pretty sure thing. But I didn't know what he'd think of it. I knew almost in advance that he wanted me to be a lawyer. And this is what he said to me. He said, well, if you haven't made up your mind, I think you should go to law school, become a lawyer. I guarantee you, by the time you're 30 years old, you'll be worth at least $3 million. Now this is 1945, 46, 47, you know. That's a lot of money in those days. And so I said to him, Dad, I gotta tell you, I think I want to be a writer. And he said, I thought for a minute there was going to be an explosion, you know. He wanted me, I could see right away what he was doing. He wanted me to get the real payoff from all these years he put in as a politician. He could send so much business my way as a lawyer and get all kinds of deals for me and so forth and so forth, and maybe even help me run for office if I wanted to, et cetera, et cetera. And it was tough for him to let go of this, but he was an American father, and it didn't even occur to him to tell me what to do. He said, if that's what you want to do, it's okay for me. By this time, I'd fallen in love with a very beautiful blonde from Yonkers. And so I was barely out of college when I got married in 1951 and moved to Yonkers. And I got a job as a reporter on the Yonkers Herald-Statesman. An absolute miracle. I get a phone call. I think maybe I got a job for you. Come in to see me. So I come down to see him. And I discover from Hausler that his secretary has just dropped dead. I would later find that it was from overwork. But and I'm ready to give him my big thing, the big Catholic thing and all that sort of thing. And he says, well, what sort of work experience have you had? I said, I was a reporter. I'm still a reporter for the Yonkers Herald-Statesman. He said, that's all I needed to know. So it was the moment that changed my whole life. From a guy from the lower middle class Irish world of Jersey City, I stepped into the elite of the literary world of New York. It really was. Hausler, well, I found out. So I went and got this job. He was a senior editor of the Reader's Digest.
Oh, okay.
But I found out only when I got to see him.
Okay.
He made several references to the book and how the book had changed my life and so forth. He assumed I knew what he was talking about. I didn't. But when I got home, I frantically got my hands on a Sunday paper, and I found out that he had written a book called The Greatest Story Ever Told, which had been #1 on the bestseller list for 2.5 years. It was a phenomenon of the publishing world, and I didn't even know about it. That's how narrow and elitist I had become in the literary world, you know. And so I realized, wow, have I got things to learn. And Hausler then took me around as his secretary, and he took me to someplace called the Dutch Tree Club, which was a luncheon club that met once a week. Everybody who was anybody in the publishing world, you know, the publisher of the Reader's Digest, this, that, everything, they were all there. And I shook hands with them all, you know. I was vaulting into the upper level, as I say, of the publishing world, you know. Hausler had written a lot of novels. And he wrote articles for the Digest, but he also wrote these books, which had been quite successful. But they're not the greatest story ever told. Made him one of the most famous authors in the country. But he had published 34 books, and one day, about 3 or 4 weeks after I'd gone to work, you know, when I was, incidentally, I wasn't even a very good typist, but that was okay. I was a newspaper man. He couldn't type either. He typed with one finger, but he could go at an incredible rate of speed. It was wonderful to see him. It was like a glimpse of the old newspaper days, you know. But at any rate, this one day I said to him, "How do you write a book?" I said, "I've never written a book. I've written term papers and so forth, but nothing longer than that. I mean, a book, that's a lot of pages and so forth." He said, "Tom, you don't write a book. You write 4 pages a day, and you write those 4 pages, whether you're hungover, you're sick as a dog, or you hadn't slept all night, or the 4 pages you wrote the day before stink, and you can smell them, they're so bad. You get to that typewriter, and you write another 4 pages, and another 4 pages. And at the end of 6 or 8 months, you've got 400 pages maybe, and you've got a first draft of what can become a book. And then you do the really important job. You rewrite it again and again and again. I went home that night and I said to my wife, I'm going to be a writer. I saw, it was like a light coming out of my head, that this was the answer to how I could work and be a writer. And so I started writing 4 pages a day. I got up in the morning at 5 a.m. and I'd write a couple of pages. Then I'd go to work. I'd come home, take a nap, quick nap, maybe 20 minutes or a half hour, then have dinner, and then I'd write more pages at night. And I did this for years and years and years. And that's how I got to be a writer. I began to see that he was a model that I could really follow, and so, but I also had, as a Catholic, I started to have experiences that were fascinating. But he was also, as I say, a prominent Catholic, Aslan was. And so one of the crime stories that he was writing was about former Mayor O'Dwyer of New York. He had gotten somebody, a judge, to leak all kinds of stuff about how O'Dwyer, when he was district attorney in Brooklyn, was really in bed with the mafia. And he had all kinds of really great stuff on it. And this was an experience that I was absolutely amazed by. He was a prominent Democratic he went on to become mayor of New York, and yet here he was really doing some very, very bad things. And then I had another kind of epiphany. He finished the O'Dwyer article, and I had typed a lot of it up, and so forth. It was devastating, it really was. But Fulton finished the article, and he handed it to me, and he said, take it down to Grand Central Station. Take it down to Grand Central Station, and you'll find a messenger there that will take it up to the Digest. So I went out on the street to call a cab to go down to Grand Central to meet this messenger. And I looked in the window of the store, and I looked at the article in my hand, and I said, can you do this? Can you help destroy the Democratic Party this way? Because I really thought that they were going to pull this off. And I just couldn't decide what to do. I said, you could take this to Democratic Party headquarters here in New York. They'd blow the whole thing, and the Democratic Party would have a counterattack, and so forth and so forth, and you'd be one of the heroes of the Democratic Party. And then so I walked around the block 4 times, and I came back and I looked in this glass in the window of the store again, and there I was with this thing in my hand. And I finally said to myself, who are you? Are you Teddy Fleming's son, the Teddy Fleming Jr. That was born in the Democratic Party in Jersey City and grew up there and was a big deal because his father was a big deal? Are you that guy, or are you a new person over here in New York? And don't you owe this man, Fulton Hassler, who gave you this job and is teaching you how to be a writer? Why can you double cross him this way? Where is your loyalty? And I looked at myself in the mirror again, and I said, you're a professional writer. You are not that guy from Jersey City anymore. And that's all there is to it. And I turned around and said, taxi? And I hailed a cab and took the thing down to Grand Central Station. And away it went. And the O'Dwyer thing ran, and so forth and so forth. And and it looked like, we were, I had passed a huge test within myself at that point. But then came a shock to end them all. This was when now in June, and it's about, I've been working for ASA for over a year, and the phone rang in my house, in my apartment in Yonkers, where I was still living, and a voice that I knew very well, Asla's daughter, April, spoke. And she said, "Tom, are you awake?" And I said, "Yeah, I know this is early in the morning." It was about 8 o'clock. And I said, "Yes, I'm awake. It's okay, April. Why are you calling?" And she said, "My father died about an hour ago." And that was one of the great shocks of my life again. And so then I became the literary executor. Yeah,
Okay.
yes. I was working on a novel that would be my first novel while I was executor of all these books and so forth. I had to write summaries and so forth and talk with the lawyers. And there was a lot of negotiation because they wanted to make a film out of the greatest story ever told. And I was involved in that. It was complicated, but nonetheless, I was working on this novel 4 pages a day and so forth. And I got it pretty much almost done. And but by this time, my days as an executor of the ASLA collected works was so forth was over. But Grace Asla, who was a really charming, lovely woman, she had written a lot of novels and so forth that Fulton published. So she had a reputation as a writer, and she knew a lot of people in the publishing world, just as Fulton did. And so she called up the editor of Cosmopolitan magazine, a guy named Jack O'Connell, and asked him if he had a job for me. And it so happened that Jack just had an opening there. Again, it was just amazing how these openings came for me, And so I became an associate editor of Cosmopolitan magazine and so forth. It was a middle-class magazine that had very good short stories by people like J.D. Salinger and so forth. And so it was a really great experience to be working as an associate editor of this, but I was also writing my novel. And in 1956, I think I thought I had it done. And I sent it to an agent, a literary agent, and she liked it. And that was another big advantage, by the way, of getting to be an editor on a magazine. You got to know all kinds of literary agents, because they were trying to sell you stuff, And so Cosmo paid very good money. So I sent the novel to this agent, and she sent it to a prominent publisher, and it was a very tough novel. It was about a priest who was trying to talk a young Catholic woman into becoming a nun. And it was a replication of my experience in St. Peter's Prep with this guy trying to turn me into a Jesuit. This was a very personal novel to me, And the editor-in-chief of this publishing house called me up and said, "This is the best novel I've read in 20 years. We're buying it." And he actually called my agent, and she called me. I said, "Oh, this is fantastic," and so forth. And so I remember going down with one of the top writers of Cosmo at the time. His name was Richard Gaiman. We went down to Toots Shor's, which was a big bar where publishing guys hung out. And we had a couple of drinks down there, celebrating my novel. And Toots was a big guy, come around, "Hey kid, how you doing?" Hey, and my pal Gaiman told me, "He just sold a novel. What do you know? Hey kid, maybe make enough dough so you come around here more often." Toots says, and he was a real character. And so the next thing I know, the book is on its way to press. I get the first stage, the edited manuscript and so forth and so forth. And then I get another call from my agent. And she says, "Are you standing up or sitting down?" And I said, standing up. She said, "Sit down. You're going to have to sit down to hear this one." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "They're not going to publish your novel." "Why?" I said, because one of the three people who are in charge of the publishing house is a very prominent Catholic woman. And she has most of the money in the publishing house. And she told them if they published this novel, she'd take all her money out of the publishing house. And they're turning it down. And this was, again, one of the all-time shocks of my life. I just couldn't get over it. And I just wondered if I could ever write another book again. And so on. It was a terrible, terrible shock. But I sat down and I talked to myself and I said, yeah, but you can keep writing. You will. You go back to write 4 pages a day, and that's all there is to it. So I had an idea for another novel, and I did go back to writing 4 pages a day. So I was doing very well, but I still, the next novel I wrote didn't sell either. It was a detective story about a novelist, a detective who was deeply sympathetic to a black guy that was accused of a crime, and he was trying to exonerate him, and it just didn't catch on. And so then I decided maybe I ought to do something different. And I'd written a number of articles for a feature we had in Cosmopolitan called The Day It Happened. It was about historical events that took place on one day. And so you needed specific events, that fit that. So I came across one that was a perfect fit, and that was the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was over in 6 or 8 or 10 hours. And so I said to the editor, I'd like to write this one myself. And I'll go up in Boston and do a little research and so forth. So he said, sure. So I went up to Boston and I started doing some research on Bunker Hill. And I was fascinated, and I found out that there hadn't been a book on the Battle of Bunker Hill in 90 years. And I said to myself, holy God, maybe I ought to write it. And so, while I was writing 4 pages a day, I suddenly started writing 4 pages a day. Instead of a novel, I started writing a nonfiction book about Bunker Hill. And by 1960, I had it done. Again, writing at night and in the morning and all that sort of stuff. And Al, my wife, helped me with the research a great deal and so forth. And I went back up to Boston again to do some more research, etc. And everybody was very helpful. They were delighted that you were writing about their city and so forth. And so the Battle of Bunker Hill comes out. And it's an astonishing success. It was reviewed in 78 newspapers. The Reader's Digest condensed it, which meant that you got an automatic $25,000 instantly. They ran condensed books in the back of the magazine, and then it also sold to something called a literary guild, which was a book club, and that guaranteed a sale of 50,000 copies on the spot. And suddenly, I was a sensation as a nonfiction writer, and I just couldn't believe it. And but I decided this is a sign I can't resist. I'm getting a message from on high here, and I quit my job with 4 kids under the age of 8. And a lot of people thought I was out of my mind, but I did it because I wanted to keep writing, and I wanted to devote myself to writing. And from that time on, from 1960 on, I have been a full-time writer.